Hello and welcome to the opening episode of our Digital Engineering Thought Leaders series. In this series, we will host subject matter experts from the industry to share actionable insights on topics such as digital engineering, BIM, ISO 19650, and common data environments. My name is Connie Butler, and I'm the Digital Engineering Specialist here at 12D Synergy. I'll also be your moderator for today's session. This thought leadership series is aimed at all professionals involved in the delivery and operation of built assets, including clients and government, asset owners and operators, and consultants and contractors. Over the coming months, you'll hear from a range of thought leaders across various topics, including practical project applications of digital engineering, a case study on information management in a CDE ecosystem, the digital twins landscape in ANZ, model federation process in accordance with ISO 19650, and much, much more. In this opening episode, we are incredibly excited to be hosting Paul Shillcock. Paul is an authority on information management and BIM, having authored Part 2 of the ISO 19650 series. Paul is the Managing Director of Operam, where he provides strategic advice to help organizations meet the latest industry standards and best practices for BIM. He's also the founder of the Operam Academy, an online resource providing training and certification in ISO 19650. Paul will be kicking off the Thought Leadership series by providing an overview of the ISO 19650 series, entitled The Who, Why, What, and How of ISO 19650. If you have any questions for Paul, you can submit your questions as shown on the screen. However, because of time zone differences, we will unfortunately not be hosting a live Q&A, but be sure to ask your questions anyway, and we'll pass them on to Paul to answer following this webinar. Anyway, that's enough from me, so here's Paul.
Hello and welcome to the who, the why, the what and the how of ISO 19650 and the collaborative production of information, otherwise known as building information modeling. And so for those of you who don't know, the ISO 19650 series define the internationally agreed standards for the effective management of information when using building information modeling. Now, before we start, I just want to let you know that I know that not everyone is as passionate about standards as I am. And this is typically the type of face that I see when I start talking about standards. So if you're pulling this face right now, I get it, all right? But at the end of the day, standards, they're important. Imagine if we didn't have the highway code and everyone just drove how they wanted to drive and on whichever side of the road they preferred. It'd be carnage. And the same is true when we produce information, without an agreed standard. And as you probably already know, the great thing about standards is that everybody has one. Everybody has their own way of producing information. And I'm not saying that one way is right and one way is wrong. I'm just suggesting that the days of my standard, and this is how I've always done it, are probably coming towards an end. But don't worry, there's still quite a long way to go. I think we still find it difficult to even agree a unified approach within a small team, let alone an entire project. But we are making progress and there is a way forward. And that is what we call the ISO 19650 series. And specifically for this session, we'll be focusing in on the production activities within the information management process. So there was a bit of a clue to the agenda in the title, but what we're going to be covering in this session is in terms of who developed the ISO 19650 series, why it was developed, what's in it, and most importantly, how can it support the collaborative production of information, otherwise known as BIM. But before I do, I'll give you a very brief introduction about myself. My name is Paul Shillcock. I'm a military engineer by background, so I was in the Royal Engineers for just under 10 years. And it's still probably the most collaborative environment that I've ever worked in terms of teams working together as opposed to working against each other. And it was quite a shock when I left the military to come out and discover quite the negative impact that things like contracts, profit, and poor leadership can have on collaboration and teams working together. And then since leaving the military, I've had a variety of different roles all with a similar sort of theme around improving the way in which organisations procure, produce, manage and use information about the built environment. And in my spare time, I've also wrote a few standards. So I'm the co-author of PAS 1192 Part 2, which was the framework document for BIM Level 2 in the UK. I'm also the author of ISO 19650 Part 2 and the UK National Annex, and also the co-author of PD 19650, which is the transition guidance from 1192 to 19650. And in 2012, I set up my own company called Operam. So there are two sides to the business. The first is on the advisory side. So we help organisations to align their business processes with the latest industry standards and best practice. We've done quite a bit of work in Australia as well. We've worked with Transport for New South Wales to help them to develop what is now the digital engineering framework. We've also worked quite closely with Operam, supporting them to become the first consultant to be certified against ISO 19650, I think in the Southern Hemisphere. And we've also helped out a bit with the Australian BIM Advisory Board or ABAP. And then the second side of the business is Operam Academy. So this is our educational business unit where we help organisations to develop the capability and capacity that they need to manage information effectively. And so Operam Academy is an online learning platform that helps people to learn about the information management process defined within the ISO 19650 series, but importantly, how to undertake their role in the process effectively. So we've also got a lot of customers in ANZ. So we've got Oricon, GHD, Kiwi Rail. I've just taken out a license, Willow, and many of the multinationals like Arup, Arcadis, Foster and Partners, and WSP. Okay, so let's start with the who, okay, in terms of who is behind the ISO 19650 series. So for those of you who are familiar with the UK 1192 series, you will know that it was used as the basis of ISO 19650, okay, and therefore you'd be forgiven of thinking that actually this is the UK yet again trying to impose their standards on the rest of the world, when actually the opposite is actually true. You know, when the UK 1192 series was published, what we found is that a lot of organisations around the world, including Australia, started to adopt the UK 1192 series and make that a requirement to their projects. And so it was actually the international community who felt this is a little bit unfair, and that if clients were going to start requesting these standards, that they had to become elevated as international standards. So it was about this international pull. And when it comes to globally agreed standards, you know, ISO are the only game in town. All right. So in this case specifically, it was ISO TC 59 SC 13, which is basically a standards committee within ISO. And SC 13 is responsible for all the standards around the organisation and digitisation of information about buildings and civil engineering works, including building information modelling. The Standards Committee itself, the Secretariat is Norway, and then you have a series of participating and observing members. So there were 31 participating members. So these were countries that were actively involved in the development of the ISO 19650 series, and then 14 observing members who had voting rights prior to publication. And when you look at the distribution, or the geographical distribution of the members, you can see that we made up pretty much most of the planet, really. And as you can see, Australia were a participating member and were actually actively involved in the meetings, albeit often dialing in remotely in the middle of the night. And there was always plenty of comments on the drafts that were sent out from the Australian Mirror Committee. So otherwise known as BD 104. So this is the Standards Mirror Committee for ISO 19650, or the Standards Committee within Australia. So their purpose really is to mirror and assist in the development of international standards, not just ISO 19650, but obviously a broad range of different standards. Inform Standards Australia around the decision making, with respect to BIM in this case, raise awareness and communicate the value to the Australian industry and encourage the broader participation within the ISO development works. That's getting people engaged, getting on board, adding comments and so on, to making sure that it's fit for purpose within the Australian industry. And if you look at the nominating organisations within BD 104, you can see that's really good representation of the industry. So if you want to know who's behind the ISO 19650 series, it's not just the UK. Have a chat with these guys. Okay, so let's move on to the why. Why do we even need information management standards? We've been producing information for years. What's the problem? And you'd be right. Before computers were even invented, we've been producing information just fine. Okay, but I think the problem is, in terms of the research and what that shows, is that the problem is that we've been producing it in silos. With architects over here, engineers over there, surveyors, construction teams, and so on. And this is how we're actually taught. When we go through university, we're very sort of siloed in terms of our profession and discipline. And the impact of this is that not only are we introducing wasteful activities, but we're also producing information that is invariably inaccurate, ambiguous, and incomplete. And this is resulting in a significant increase in both cost and time. And where we are today is that right now, construction clients basically have a 50-50 chance of getting their asset delivered on time and on budget. Okay, and if you think that's bad, that gets even worse when it comes to sort of large infrastructure type projects. For all the promises that we get from vendors that buying their software and technology will make all these problems go away, the research actually suggests that we're actually getting worse, not better. And for all the technology and innovation, all it enables us to do is to produce poor quality information quicker than we could with the previous tool. Okay, now I'm not blaming the vendor. Okay, it's not the vendor's fault. It's because, yes, the tools that we're using are changing, okay, but the way we're managing information isn't. Okay, we're still working in those silos. So we need to work out a way of working that can actually break down those silos so that teams can start to work collaboratively. We need to switch from the production of information as individuals and my standard to the collaborative production of information as a team. Where everybody is focused on getting it right first time and working effectively as a team to get the job done. And this is why we need the ISO 19650 series. So I'll assume that most of you heard of ISO 19650, but what you may not know is what's inside each of the 5 standards. All right, so I'm going to give you a very brief introduction to each one. So first up, in part 1, we have part 1 talks around the concepts and principles for the management of information throughout the entire asset lifecycle. That's both the delivery and the operational phase. So part 1, as you might gather, is a good starting point for anybody just getting to grips with the information management process. Part 2 sets out the information management process for the management of information during the delivery phase of assets. Okay, so basically projects. And this includes also a national annex. All right, and the reason for that is that when we were developing part 2 in particular, with the international community, there were some things that we just realized we were never going to get an international consensus on. So the decision was made to, rather than to prolong that, is to drop those into a national annex, which gives each country or region the opportunity to add clarifications about how ISO 19650 is to be implemented within that particular country or region. And it's BD 104 who looks after the Australian National Annex. Part 3 sets out the information management process for the management of information during the operational phase of assets. Now, part 3 is actually the prequel to part 2. All right, so if you're an asset owner, then your starting point should be part 3 before you move on to part 2. Okay, and when you start to look at the activities within it, that'll become clear why that's the case. Part 4 looks at the effective exchange of information between parties. Now, this is the only part that's yet to be published. The public consultation for which is just closed. But again, there's likely to be a national annex because we're talking about the structure of data to be exchanged. In the UK, that's likely to be based upon BS 1192 Part 4, which is basically the UK's version of COBE. And then finally, we've got Part 5, which looks at adopting a security-minded approach to managing information. Okay, and the reason this came about is that most asset owners' security policy is generally one of chaos, in terms of if they can't find the information, then clearly no one else can. All right, but now a lot of their information is becoming structured and it's becoming managed online. There are now a whole host of new threats and vulnerabilities. All right, so Part 5 helps asset owners to identify which of their assets are deemed to be sensitive and helps them to put measures in place to secure the associated information. Okay, so that's the ISO 19650 series. There is a 6th standard looking at health and safety to be being proposed, and that's currently work on that is already underway. So finally, how can ISO 19650 help teams to work together on the collaborative production of information? How can we ensure that when teams come together, they know what needs to be done and how it needs to be done? All right, but this generally, it's not rocket science. In fact, it's so simple that it's almost embarrassing to talk to experienced professionals like yourself. Okay, but the first thing is that everybody must agree the information standard against which all information will be produced. So that information can be used and reused throughout the asset lifecycle by other teams without the need for translation or loss of integrity. All right, and I don't mean the team with a little t, I mean the entire project team. So a team with a big team. That could be something as simple as language, the terms, abbreviations and acronyms that can be used, but generally includes things like units, text styles, line styles, color tables, symbology, and any associated templates that can make all of that a lot easier. Things like the global origin and grid referencing system, so that geometrical models can be spatially coordinated. Name conventions, asset tagging, file formats, data structure, data syntax. Even just agreeing a date format would solve so many problems. And where possible, all these information standards should be based on open data standards such as industry foundation classes and so on. But the most important thing, regardless of whether they're open standards or not, is that the standards are agreed, they're documented, and they're used by everybody on the project. And then secondly, for each of the activity, teams need to consider and agree what the most effective production methods and tools are going to be for each activity. That includes generating information, coordinating, acquiring information about existing assets, checking, review, approve, authorization, and acceptance of that information. Are you going to go traditional with lines, arcs, and text, which is a valid approach, or are you planning to immerse yourselves in a 3-dimensional virtual reality world? All right, so this is an opportunity for teams to really start to innovate, and share best practices. But as a word of caution, whatever method you choose to adopt, you need to make sure that the teams involved in the production of information have the capability and capacity to adopt that approach. Okay, because if not, you're going to come unstuck. And once all that's been agreed, the most important thing then is to get it documented. A lot of the time you have all these great ideas and then expect the delivery team to just run with it. Okay, it's not going to happen. So it's important that the production methods and procedures are documented so that they can be applied consistently, measured and optimized. Okay, so bring in a lot of the lean principles. All right, it's also a useful tool to educate teams and individuals on what they actually need to do as part of their role. And finally, for me, the collaborative production of information is very much around people and process, but there's no getting away from the fact that it is enabled by technology. Most importantly, the project team need a shared repository where they can store and share information securely. And this is where the common data environment, or CDE, comes into play. All right, and the CDE is the enabling technologies that supports the collaborative production of information. All right, and you may also know that the thing about common data environments is that actually they're not that common. Well, not particularly at a project level, at least. But we are starting to see more and more projects adopting CDEs at the project level, rather than a load of local CDEs, and I expect that to become the norm over the next few years too. And it's important, because the CDE plays a big job in managing all the different types of information that we need to produce. Okay, so typically, a common data environment is going to be made up of several IT systems, such as document management systems, engineering management systems, relational databases, and geospatial information systems. Each of which will manage a specific type of information. The CDE also hosts a lot of information collected from what we call data acquisition systems, such as CCTV, monitoring systems, and survey equipment. And in most cases, the CDE is also linked to a wide range of enterprise business systems, such as planning, costing, finance, and HR systems. So as you can see, a CDE is actually an integrated network of systems that provide a centralized repository for the management of information. Okay, so that's a very quick run through of the who, the why, the what, and the how of ISO 19650. I hope you've enjoyed the session, and hopefully you've learned something too. If you've got any questions or would just like to connect, use the QR code to find me on LinkedIn. So that's it from me. Thank you, and bye for now.
Thanks, Paul. That was an excellent overview of the ISO 19650 series. If you'd like to learn more about ISO 19650, we've put together a comprehensive overview of the series, available from the 12D Synergy website. The guide distills the key concepts and principles of the standard throughout the information management process. Finally, we're calling all thought leaders. If you or a colleague have an innovative topic to share, we'd love to hear from you. Please get in touch with us at info@12dsynergy.com. That's all for now. If you want to catch up on anything you've missed today or want to share this content with a colleague, I'll be sharing the recording of this webinar to you all shortly. Thanks for joining us today, and stay tuned for more episodes in our Digital Engineering Thought Leadership series.